There are some moments in rock history that feel larger than life, flashes of brilliance that seem almost impossible to explain. Freddie Mercury was one of those rare people who could walk onto a stage and make an entire stadium feel like it was floating. Whether it was his theatrical movements, his flawless vocal control, or his ability to connect with anyone in the crowd, Mercury wasn't just a singer, he was a phenomenon. But behind the spotlight, behind the glittering costumes and the thunderous applause, Freddie Mercury was also a deeply opinionated musician. He cared about sound, about tone, and about the feel of every note that made its way into a Queen song. And there was one song in particular that he had strong feelings about, so strong, in fact, that he outright refused to play on it. That song was "You're My Best Friend." The perfectionist behind the legend. Before diving into why Freddie refused to play on that track, it helps to understand who he was behind the glam. Mercury's public image often focused on his flamboyance and charisma, but what really defined him as a musician was his obsession with excellence. He was classically trained, a skilled pianist, and someone who approached music like an architect, carefully constructing melodies, harmonies, and arrangements that sounded effortless but were incredibly complex underneath. You can hear that precision in songs like Bohemian Rhapsody,
Open your eyes, look up to the skies and see,
or Somebody to Love. Every harmony was meticulously layered.
somebody to love.
Every piano chord carried weight. Freddie wasn't just performing, he was orchestrating a moment. But that level of control came with strong opinions. And when technology started creeping into rock music during the mid-1970s, Freddie wasn't always eager to embrace it. The birth of "You're My Best Friend." In 1975, Queen were at the height of their creative powers. The band had just finished recording A Night at the Opera,
Seaside, whenever you stroll along with me, really contemplating what
the album that would change their lives forever. It was the record that gave the world Bohemian Rhapsody and cemented their reputation as musical innovators. But alongside Mercury's masterpieces sat another song, one written not by him, but by bassist John Deacon. Deacon was often the quiet one in Queen. While Freddie and Brian may commanded the spotlight, Deacon stayed in the background, quietly crafting melodies that could melt even the coldest heart. "You're My Best Friend" was his creation, a warm, sincere love song written for his wife, Veronica. The track was sweet, melodic, and unlike much of Queen's bombastic catalog. It wasn't a grand anthem or a complex operatic experiment. It was simple, but that simplicity was its strength. There was just one problem: the instrument it was written on. The Wurlitzer dilemma. John Deacon composed "You're My Best Friend" on a Wurlitzer electric piano, an instrument with a distinct, slightly tinny sound. It was smaller, lighter, and far less powerful than the majestic grand pianos Freddie was used to playing. For Mercury, this was almost sacrilegious. He loved the fullness of an acoustic grand, the kind of instrument that could roar in one moment and whisper in the next. To him, the Wurlitzer felt like a toy compared to the expressive depth of a real piano. So when it came time to record "You're My Best Friend," Freddie was faced with a choice: play the song on an instrument he didn't believe in, or let someone else do it. He chose the latter. In a 1977 interview with BBC Radio 1, Mercury didn't mince words. "I refuse to play the damn thing," he said. "It's tinny and horrible, and I don't like them. Why play those things when you've got a lovely, superb grand piano?" John Deacon, calm as ever, didn't argue. Instead, he simply took the electric piano home and learned to play the part himself. The result was the version of "You're My Best Friend" that would go on to become one of Queen's most beloved songs, all without Freddie touching a single key. What the song meant to Queen. For many fans, "You're My Best Friend" became an emotional touchstone, a soft, affectionate counterpoint to Queen's larger-than-life sound. It showed that even a band known for operatic excess could find beauty in simplicity. The song climbed the charts, peaking at number 7 in the UK and number 16 in the US, helping Queen cement their reputation as more than just a rock opera band. Still, behind the scenes, Freddie's feelings about the track remained complicated. He respected John's songwriting, no question, but artistically, it didn't feel like a Freddie Mercury song. It lacked the drama and intensity that he loved to deliver on stage. Even when Queen performed You're My Best Friend live, Freddie would play it on his preferred grand piano instead of the Wurlitzer. But as the years went by, the song slowly disappeared from their set lists altogether. Freddie's relationship with instruments. To understand why Freddie cared so much about the type of piano used, you have to look at his musical philosophy. Mercury saw instruments as extensions of emotion. He wasn't interested in technology for its own sake. He cared about how something felt. That's why he was slow to embrace synthesizers, instruments that became increasingly common in the 1980s. In fact, early Queen albums proudly stated on their sleeves, "No synthesizers." It was a statement of purity, a promise to fans that every sound came from a human touch. Of course, by the time the 1980s rolled around, even Freddie began to soften that stance. Songs like Radio GAGA,
I'd sit alone and watch your light, my only friend.
and I Want to Break Free relied heavily on synths,
I want to break free.
showing that Mercury wasn't completely opposed to change. He just needed to feel that it served the song. But You're My Best Friend came from an earlier time, when his artistic pride and perfectionism were at their peak. The Wurlitzer didn't inspire him, so he stepped aside. The gentleman bassist, John Deacon's moment. If Freddie's refusal to play might sound dramatic, it actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise for John Deacon. Deacon had always been the quiet creative force in Queen, writing major hits like Another One Bites the Dust and I Want to Break Free.
Walks further down the street with the pool way down low.
But You're My Best Friend was one of his earliest major contributions to the band. He once said in an interview, "Freddie didn't like the electric piano, so I took it home and I started to learn on it. That's the song that came out when I was learning to play piano. It sounds best on that." In a way, Deacon's gentle insistence helped shape the song's charm. The Wurlitzer's slightly dreamy tone gave it warmth, something that might have been lost if Freddie had forced it through a grand piano. So even though Mercury refused to play it, the decision preserved the song's authenticity. It was John's composition, his sound, his emotion, and that's what makes it special. Live performances and evolution. When Queen performed You're My Best Friend live in the late 1970s, the setup was simple. Freddie would take to the grand piano and deliver it with his signature flair, even though it wasn't his instrument of choice in the studio. But as the 1980s arrived, Queen's live shows began to change. Mercury started moving away from the piano altogether, preferring to roam the stage and interact with fans. He'd only sit down at the keys for certain moments, usually for songs like Bohemian Rhapsody or Somebody to Love. By the time the Game tour ended in 1980, You're My Best Friend quietly disappeared from the set list. The band had evolved, and so had Freddie. It didn't resurface until years later, long after Mercury's passing, when surviving members brought it back in tribute. What the moment says about Freddie. It's easy to frame this story as Freddie Mercury being stubborn, but it's really about artistic integrity. For him, every note mattered. He didn't want to compromise the emotional truth of his performance by playing an instrument that didn't move him. He once said in another interview, "I'm not going to be dictated to by fashion or trends. I'll do what feels right." And that philosophy guided his entire career. Freddie Mercury wasn't afraid to make bold choices, whether it was experimenting with opera in Bohemian Rhapsody, blending funk into Another One Bites the Dust, or simply saying no to an instrument that didn't inspire him. In the end, his refusal wasn't an act of arrogance. It was an act of passion. Legacy of a reluctant pianist. Ironically, the man who refused to play You're My Best Friend would later inspire countless pianists around the world. Freddie's distinctive approach to the piano, percussive yet melodic, forceful yet elegant, became a blueprint for generations of rock performers. Even though he eventually distanced himself from the instrument on stage, preferring to let his voice do the work, his fingerprints remain all over Queen's catalog. From the thunderous chords of Don't Stop Me Now
I'm gonna have myself.
to the haunting delicacy of Love of My Life, the piano was always there.
Love of my life, you hurt me.
Even when Freddie wasn't physically playing it. And in a strange way, You're My Best Friend fits perfectly within that legacy. It's the one Queen song that showed Freddie could step back, trust his bandmates, and let someone else's sound shine through. So what does this story really tell us about Freddie Mercury? It tells us that behind the glitter and grandiosity was a true artist, someone who valued authenticity over convenience. It shows us that even in disagreement, Queen's strength came from their differences. Freddie didn't play on "You're My Best Friend," but in refusing to, he allowed John Deacon's voice to shine, literally and figuratively. The result was a timeless song that continues to touch hearts nearly 50 years later. And that's the beauty of Queen. They weren't four identical minds. They were four contrasting visions, colliding and combining to create something unforgettable. So the next time you hear "You're My Best Friend" playing on the radio, remember, that bright, shimmering piano line you hear isn't Freddie. It's John Deacon, playing the very instrument Freddie refused to touch. But somehow, that decision only made the band's story richer. Proof that even rock legends sometimes say no, and that saying no can create something truly iconic.